Hey, Jeremy Wallace here, Microsoft Certified Azure Solutions Architect, Expert, and Senior Cloud Infrastructure Engineer for Safari Micro. This is my next video in the AZ-140, Configuring and Operating Microsoft Azure Virtual Desktop. We're going to cover two units today. Virtual machine sizing for Azure Virtual Desktop and virtual desktop pricing. With that said, why don't we dive right in? So if we take a look at this unit, the first thing Microsoft provides here is a link for the virtual machine sizing guidelines. This is a great resource. It brings you to this page, and we'll cover more information on this page in just a moment. But I do want to bring us back to the graphic that's provided in this unit. If you're familiar with Azure, and hopefully you're getting pretty familiar with it as you dive into Azure Virtual Desktop, but if you're not, there are a plethora of virtual machine sizes available in Azure, and they're all designed. They're series of virtual machine sizes that are each designed for a particular workload. So you can see some examples of those workloads on this graphic here. We have our entry level with the AV2 series, our burstable size, so burstable virtual machine sizes. You don't get 100% of the capacity of the virtual machine at all times. This virtual machine size is designed for workloads that have short moments of bursts of virtual machine usage, compute power usage, and then they remain idle other times. And during those idle periods, they build up credits that can be then traded in for more CPU compute time. And so those are great for workloads like, for instance, domain controllers, where the only thing that you're running is a domain controller. It's only doing mainly authentication. Um, that's more of a burstable workload. There's going to be periods of where it's going to be using compute power, and then other times when it's not. So that's great for that burstable series. I would generally avoid using the burstable series for Azure Virtual Desktops. For most part, you're going to be wanting to utilize other sizes that do give you that compute power at all times. And so there's their general purpose and confidential computing that uses the D series. That's what they recommend for that. Compute intensive, the F series, memory optimized, E series. So in the compute intensive, you'll see more CPU ratio in that. So higher CPU count, lower RAM count, memory optimized, higher RAM count, lower CPU count. There's the GPU accelerated. Those are for your graphics workloads, and this is one actually I typically like to use the most for Azure Virtual Desktop workloads, whether they are for workloads designed specifically for GPU, like AutoCAD workloads or Photoshop and marketing type workloads. Those are must to have in a series like the NV4 series, particularly is what I typically use for Azure Virtual Desktop most of the time. But it is great nowadays. Most of what we interact with on our desktops are graphical in nature. So having a GPU accelerated virtual desktop size just lends a better experience, in my opinion, to your virtual desktop, because it has that additional GPU. So I'll typically use anywhere from NV8 as the smallest to NV32 as the highest, particularly for multi-session. That gets expensive if you're trying to do a personal, and we'll talk a little bit more about personal versus multi-session sizes here in a moment. But again, GPU accelerated NVV4 series in particular is something I highly recommend in the Azure Virtual Desktop world. The 8 series for high performance computing, and then you have your storage optimized sizes in the L series. I took out pieces from this link, the machine sizing guidelines for Azure Virtual Desktop, and I put them in here. And so we'll just touch on the pieces that I extracted. They do list out the workload types. This is a very handy thing to know when you're sizing virtual desktops. Is the user workload. So if you have Users, they'll fall into one of these categories: light, medium, heavy, or power, and they define it in this guideline. So light, think users doing basic data entry tasks. They provide some examples of the applications: database entry applications, command line interfaces. Medium, workload type is for consultants and market researchers. They're doing those other things, but also maybe some Word and some static web pages. Heavy workload type is for software engineers and content creators. So all the other stuff, plus also Outlook, PowerPoint, dynamic web pages, software development, and then power users, with the power workload for graphic designers, 3D model makers, machine learner researchers, and so all that other stuff too, plus maybe photo and video editing, computer aided design, computer aided manufacturing. So more of those intense workloads for that power workload type. So where does that come into play? Well, keep that in mind as you pick the size that should be used for your host. So single session, as I mentioned before, is that one person to one host scenario. So host pool is what you connect to in a single session or a personal virtual desktop scenario, one person per host. So it's essentially a private host for a individual. And so they suggest in that case that light use maybe a 2 vCPU, 8 GB RAM, 32 GB storage. So they provide some example instances for that. So D2SV5, D2SV4. And so again, that's light, so that's database entry. Medium, you have the database entry command line interface and maybe some static web pages, maybe some Word in there. So they're suggesting D4, so that's your 4 CPU count in there. Heavy, a D8 for personal. And so your heavy is going to be more of the rest of the Microsoft Office suite and some dynamic web pages. Multi-session, whereas the single session is one person to one host. Multi-session again is multiple people connecting to single instances of hosts, and so you're typically going to have multiple hosts. If it's a smaller environment, you can probably get away with one host. But how do you size that? Again, you take these workloads, you got light, medium, heavy, and power, and they provide some recommendations of what that would look like. So for if it was all light users, they're just doing some maybe database entry type stuff, then they suggest a minimum of 8 vCPU, 16 GB RAM for a single host, and no more than 6 people per CPU. So we got 8 CPUs, 16, uh, 16, 6 users per each of those CPUs. And so that's how many people that you can stick on a single host, 8 times 6. And then so they provide some example Azure instances here: D8, F8, D16, F16, D16. So these are some example series that you could use for the individual session hosts, but they're saying this is probably the most important part. The key part of the sizing guideline is no more than 6 people per core. The less people per core that you put on a host, the better the overall experience is for everybody else. If you're going over that, everyone's quality connected to that host is going to lower because you have just too many people on a session host. So that's how you read the sizing guidelines. Medium workloads, no more than 4 people per uh, per CPU. And their recommendation is a minimum of 8 vCPU, 16 GB RAM. So 8, 16, 24, 32, no more than 32 people on this host if it's using 8 vCPU. And they give you some example instances: D8, D16. Heavy, no more than 2 people per vCPU. So that's got 16 people per this host if you're using the minimum 8 vCPU, 16 GB RAM. Power, no more than 1 person per vCPU. And they recommend at least 6 vCPUs, 56 GB RAM in the sizing guideline. So what I've typically used a lot of the times personally, and again, this is completely up to you as a professional creating this environment. But for me, my personal preference when working with Azure Virtual Desktop again has been to use in multi-session scenarios the NVV4 series Virtual Desktop. So again, you have your D8, your NV8. You have your NV16, NV32. So you can see those in the recommendations here around workload types. And so that's what I've used for a lot of these workloads. Light, typically light. I still don't even use the GPU around light. If it's a smaller environment, if it's a lot, you can pack a lot more people on those. But we're going to get into the pros and cons of being able to do that in a moment here. As we take a look at a few of the other recommendations that on that page. So here's a few other things to note from their documentation. For multi-session workloads, you should limit VM size to between 4 vCPU and 24 vCPU for the following two reasons. All VMs should have more than two cores or less, and you run into stability problems with your virtual desktop. So keep that in mind. And then VMs shouldn't have more than 32 cores. So that's why I mentioned that even when I'm using the NVB4 series. Of course, they only go up to 32 cores there, but that 32 cores is the max that you should be doing on a session host. You can scale out more session hosts to meet people, and you can put less people per core on each of those session hosts, but you shouldn't be putting more than 32 cores per a session host. The recommended range between 4 and 24 cores generally provides a better capacity return for your users as you increase the number of cores. For example, if you have 12 users sign in at the same time to a VM of 4 cores, the ratio is 3 users per core. Meanwhile, a VM with 8 cores and 14 users, the ratio is 1.75 users per core. In this scenario, the later configuration with ratio of 1.75 offers greater burst capacity for your applications that have short-term CPU demand. So what that is stating is if you have a higher machine size for your users, that gives them a higher burst. They can burst up to a higher compute power because the machine itself is a higher compute machine. So if you have 8 cores versus 4 cores on that machine, they're going to be able to burst up for if they're running a process that's intensive. It has the full power of the 8 cores to utilize instead of just hitting the ceiling at 4 cores. And so that's some of the difference there is that when you have multiple users on a bigger size machine, the ceiling's higher for those individual users. Even if you stick to the same type of ratio or mess around with the ratio numbers there, the overall ceiling for them is the top end of the resource that you have assigned to that session host. But the recommendations they have here at a true larger scale for scenarios with 20 or more users connected to a single VM, several smaller VMs would perform better than one large VM. So in this recommendation here, they say it's better to have a bunch of smaller VMs. Say you had 8 NV or 8 virtual AVD hosts that users connect to instead of just 3 NV32 hosts or whatever you want to split that up. But having the smaller but more of them provides a better experience for your multi-session users at a larger scale than if you had just a handful of session hosts that are very large. And that comes into play too when you're talking about, and this is what they kind of mention here in this bottom part, is the maintenance aspect of it. If you have a problem happen with one session host, it's easier to provide maintenance for that session host when you have a bunch of them and there's only a little bit of users connected to that one session host. It's a better chance that you can move them off, rather than if you have a quarter of your company on one host and now they have to all go down and you have to figure out what to do with the rest of them while you perform emergency maintenance or whatever the case is with that host. So having them spread out over more hosts is generally just a better experience from a management perspective as well, and being able to rebuild a host if you need to or troubleshoot that, and have the user spread out across other hosts. General virtual machine recommendations, they also recommend premium SSD storage, especially if you want to be able to use the SLA on that. Graphics processing, again, that NV series is what I would recommend there. The Azure Virtual Desktop pricing. Architecture for Azure Virtual Desktop solution is a realized cost savings. Here are 5 different options to help manage costs for enterprises. And so you have your multi-session, putting more people on a session host. You're going to be able to divide that cost over them. You can take advantage of Azure Hybrid Benefit to save you some costs. On the licensing of the OS, Azure Reserved Instances to save you cost on running the virtual machine, and then session host load balancing, packing more people to each individual host or spreading them out over multiple hosts. So those are the different type of things that you want to play around to get a better cost difference. And that's a huge benefit in Azure Virtual Desktop, is being able to get better bang for your buck. All right, with that said, that's it for these 2 units. Check out my next videos.